Arsenio Barrett had everything money could buy, except the ability to see that his wife was dying right in front of him. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. Their fifth anniversary celebration sparkled across the Manhattan penthouse like something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbows on ivory walls, imported roses perfuming the air, and 50 of the city's most powerful people toasting their enduring love story. What a joke. Shirley Harris Barrett stood at the edge of their living room, watching her husband charm everyone except her. She pressed one hand against her still flat stomach where their secret grew, 8 weeks and 3 days of pure miracle, while her other hand gripped her champagne flute so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd been trying to get Arsenio alone all evening to share the news that would change their lives forever, but he moved through the party like she was invisible furniture. Shirley, darling. Regina Whitmore, wife of Arsenio's biggest competitor, swept over in a cloud of expensive perfume and fake concern. You look absolutely radiant tonight. That sapphire dress brings out your eyes beautifully. Thank you, Shirley managed, forcing her practiced smile. The dress had been a calculated choice, the same one she'd worn on their first date 5 years ago, when Arsenio couldn't keep his hands off her, when he'd whispered that she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. And how are things with you two lovebirds? Regina's eyes glittered with the hungry curiosity of someone hoping for gossip, still as madly in love as ever. Before Shirley could answer, Arsenio's laughter cut across the room like broken glass. She turned to see him surrounded by his usual circle of business associates and investors, his green eyes bright with the kind of passion he used to reserve for her. Now it was all for deals, mergers, and profit margins. "Children?" James Morrison, Arsenio's business partner, was saying loudly enough for half the party to hear. "When are you and Shirley going to give us some little Barretts to spoil?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Shirley's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the perfect moment for Arsenio to turn to her with love in his eyes, to pull her close and let her share their beautiful secret with the world. Instead, Arsenio's face twisted with something that looked like disgust. "Children?" He took a long drink of his whiskey, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when discussing failed investments. "With her? Have you seen Shirley lately, James? She can barely handle being a wife, let alone a mother." "Honestly." He glanced around the circle, ensuring he had their full attention before delivering the killing blow. "I can't even stand being in the same room with her anymore. She's become this pathetic, clingy thing, like furniture that keeps rearranging itself, hoping you'll notice." The laughter that followed felt like acid in Shirley's veins. Her champagne glass slipped from numb fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of crystal and golden wine. The sound cut through the party chatter like a gunshot. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward her, including Arsenio's, and for one breathtaking moment she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, recognition, guilt, but it vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. "Careful there," he said with the same tone he'd use for a clumsy waitress, already turning back to his conversation. "Someone clean that up." Shirley stood frozen in the center of their anniversary party, surrounded by the wreckage of her shattered glass and her even more shattered heart. The baby, their baby, fluttered in her womb like a butterfly trapped in a hurricane, and she wondered if even an unborn child could feel its mother's heart breaking. "Excuse me," she whispered to no one in particular, because apparently no one was listening anyway. She walked through their penthouse on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, past the photos of their wedding day, where Arsenio gazed at her like she was his whole world, past the kitchen where he used to dance with her while making Sunday morning pancakes, past the piano where she used to play the song he wrote for her during their honeymoon. All of it felt like evidence from someone else's life. In their master bedroom, Shirley sank onto the edge of their California king bed and stared at her reflection in the mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her wore a designer dress that cost more than most people's cars, flawless makeup applied by a professional, and jewelry that could fund a small country. She looked like the perfect billionaire's wife. She looked absolutely miserable. Her hands trembled as she reached for the drawer of her nightstand, pulling out the positive pregnancy test she'd been hiding there for weeks. 2 pink lines that represented everything she'd ever wanted. A family with the man she loved more than breathing. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. Arsenio's face lighting up with joy, his strong hands spanning her belly, his voice thick with emotion as he whispered promises to their unborn child. Instead, he'd just announced to 50 people that the thought of having children with her made him sick. "He doesn't know," she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking. "He doesn't know about you, sweetheart." But even as she said it, a terrible truth crystallized in her mind like ice forming on glass. It wouldn't matter if he knew. The man who'd just humiliated her in front of half of Manhattan society, who looked at her like she was an annoying obligation, who couldn't stand being in the same room with her, that man would never want their baby any more than he wanted her. The party continued downstairs, Arsenio's laughter floating up through the floors like mockery. Shirley closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. She was done being furniture in her own life. From the nightstand drawer, she pulled out a leather-bound journal, the same one where she'd been writing letters to Arsenio that she never had the courage to give him. Letters about how much she loved him, how proud she was of his success, how desperately she missed the man who used to see her as his equal partner instead of an expensive accessory. Tonight, she would write one final letter. But this one would be different. This one would be goodbye. As Shirley began to write, her tears falling onto paper like rain, she didn't notice Arsenio's business associate step out onto their private terrace to take a phone call. She didn't see him pause outside their bedroom window, his face growing pale as he overheard her whispered words to her unborn child. And she certainly didn't know that in exactly 72 hours, that phone call would set into motion a chain of events that would destroy everything Arsenio Barrett had ever built, starting with the most precious thing he'd never realized he had. Chapter 2. The Letters of a Broken Heart. The cruelest thing about loving someone who doesn't love you back is that hope dies slowly, one small betrayal at a time. Shirley stared at the blank page in her journal, her pen hovering over paper like a sword over a dying dream. Downstairs, the anniversary party was finally winding down. She could hear car doors slamming, engines starting, the last of their guests fleeing the scene of her public execution. In a few minutes, Arsenio would come upstairs, probably drunk, definitely pleased with himself for closing another business deal while his wife's heart bled out on their Italian marble floors. 3 days had passed since the party, and he still hadn't asked why she'd been so quiet, why she barely ate, why she flinched every time he spoke to her. The man who used to notice when she got a haircut couldn't be bothered to notice that his wife was drowning. "My dearest Arsenio," she wrote, her handwriting shaking. "Tonight you called me pathetic in front of 50 people. Tomorrow you'll probably forget you said it. But I'll remember it forever, because it was the moment I realized that the man I married died somewhere along the way, and I've been in love with a ghost." The words poured out of her like blood from a wound. 3 years of silent suffering, 3 years of watching the love of her life transform into a stranger who wore her husband's face. She wrote about their honeymoon in Tuscany when he'd carried her across every threshold for practice, about the morning he'd surprised her with coffee in bed just because it was Tuesday, about the night he'd stayed up holding her while she cried over her father's death. "I gave up my career at the Metropolitan Museum for you. I gave up my friends, my dreams, my identity. I became Mrs. Arsenio Barrett and forgot that Shirley Harris ever existed. I thought love meant sacrifice, but I never realized that sacrifice without appreciation is just slow suicide." Her phone buzzed. A text from Arsenio. Working late. Don't wait up. It was barely 10 p.m. Shirley laughed, a sound so broken it scared her. Don't wait up. She'd been waiting up for 3 years, waiting for him to come home, waiting for him to notice her, waiting for him to remember he had a wife who loved him. Tonight would be the last night she'd ever wait for Arsenio Barrett. She opened her laptop and began researching things she'd never thought she'd need to know. Divorce lawyers, apartment rentals, how to disappear completely when you're married to one of the most powerful men in New York. Every search felt like another step away from the life she'd built and towards something terrifyingly unknown. But as she scrolled through possibilities, her hand kept drifting to her stomach. The baby changed everything. This wasn't just about her anymore. I need to tell you something that will probably mean nothing to you, but means everything to me. I'm carrying your child, our child. 10 weeks of pure miracle growing inside me. I've been trying to find the courage to tell you for weeks, waiting for the right moment, the right mood, the right version of the man I married to resurface. After tonight, I know that moment will never come. You don't want children with the woman you can't stand to be around. You don't want a family with furniture that keeps rearranging itself. So I'm making this decision for all 3 of us. Her tears fell onto the keyboard, and she wondered if this was what dying felt like. Not all at once, but piece by piece, heartbeat by heartbeat, until nothing remained but the shell of who you used to be. From her jewelry box, she pulled out the ultrasound photo from her doctor's appointment that morning. Dr. Chen had smiled as she'd pointed to the tiny flicker on the screen. "There's your baby's heartbeat," she'd said. "Strong and perfect, just like Mama." Shirley had stared at that miraculous rhythm, imagining sharing the moment with Arsenio, imagining his hand in hers as they witnessed their child's first performance. Instead, she'd sat alone on the examination table, grieving for a marriage that had already flatlined. "I'm going to love this baby enough for both parents. I'm going to give our child everything you can't: time, attention, presence, unconditional love. I'm going to be the parent I wish you could remember how to be, and I'm going to make sure our child never feels invisible in their own life." The apartment suddenly felt suffocating. Shirley walked to their floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering Manhattan skyline that had once seemed like a promise of endless possibilities. Now it looked like a beautiful prison, all glass and steel and cold reflected light. Behind her reflection, she could see their wedding photo on the nightstand, Arsenio lifting her over the threshold of their first apartment, both of them laughing like they'd won the lottery. That couple looked so happy, so in love, so certain their story would have a perfect ending. What fools they'd been. "Do you remember our first dance? You sang in my ear, off-key and terrible and absolutely perfect. You said you'd never been happier in your life. You said I made you want to be the best man you could be. I keep wondering where that man went, and if there's anything I could have done to keep him. I've tried everything. I supported your career even when it meant moving across the country away from my family. I smiled through business dinners where your partners ignored me completely. I pretended not to notice when you stopped kissing me goodbye, stopped asking about my day, stopped seeing me as anything more than an expensive household appliance." Her phone buzzed again. Another text. "Closing the Shanghai deal tonight. This could be worth 500 million. Don't wait up for the rest of the week." Don't wait up for the rest of the week. As if she were some needy puppy rather than the woman who'd stood by his side through every triumph, every setback, every 3 a.m. phone call that pulled him away from their dinner table, their bed, their life together. Shirley deleted the message without responding and continued writing. "I want you to know that leaving you isn't revenge, it isn't punishment, it's survival. I can't keep loving someone who finds my existence unbearable. Our baby deserves better than a father who sees them as a burden and a mother who's forgotten how to breathe without permission." I hope someday you find whatever it is you're looking for in those hotel deals and merger meetings and late-night phone calls. I hope it loves you back better than I did. I hope it keeps you warm at night and laughs at your jokes and makes you feel like the man you used to be. Outside their window, the city pulsed with life. Millions of people living and loving and building futures together. Somewhere out there, Shirley thought, there were couples who still looked at each other like they were miracles. Somewhere, there were men who came home to their wives like they were returning to the best part of themselves. Arsenio used to be one of those men. Now he was downstairs closing deals while his marriage collapsed one floor above him. I'm setting you free, my love. Free from the wife you can't stand, free from the responsibility of pretending to care about my feelings, free from having to share your precious time with someone you consider pathetic and clingy. Consider this my final gift to the man I'll love until my last breath, even if he can't love me back. Take care of yourself, Arsenio, and if you ever remember who we used to be, who we could have been, don't look for us. Some broken things can't be fixed, no matter how much love you throw at them. Forever yours, whether you want me or not, Shirley. She signed her name with a flourish, sealing her fate with ink and tears. Tomorrow she would begin the practical work of disappearing. Tonight she would mourn the death of everything she'd believed in. Shirley pulled out her grandmother's wooden jewelry box, a family heirloom that had witnessed 3 generations of love stories. Inside, she placed her wedding rings, the stunning engagement ring Arsenio had chosen himself, and the simple gold band they'd exchanged during their vows. The rings felt heavy with the weight of broken promises as she set them on top of the ultrasound photo. The letters came next, dozens of them spanning years of loneliness. Her love letter on their first anniversary that she'd been too shy to give him. Her apology letter after their first real fight about his long hours. Her congratulations letter when his company went public that she'd written but never delivered because he'd been too busy celebrating with clients to come home. Every letter was a window into a heart that had never stopped believing, right up until tonight. Finally, she placed the positive pregnancy test on top of everything else, the 2 pink lines that should have been the beginning of their greatest adventure. Instead, they would be his final reminder of everything he'd thrown away. As footsteps echoed on the stairs, Arsenio finally coming to bed at 1:30 a.m., Shirley closed the box and set it in the center of their bed, like an offering on an altar. She grabbed her overnight bag from the closet and paused at their bedroom door for one last look at the room where she'd been happier than she'd ever thought possible and more miserable than she'd ever imagined she could survive. The footsteps stopped outside their door. Shirley held her breath, part of her hoping against hope that Arsenio would burst through the door and see her pain, would finally ask what was wrong, would somehow sense that their whole world was about to change forever. Instead, she heard him turn toward his study. Even now, even at nearly 2 a.m., he was choosing work over coming to bed with his wife. Shirley slipped out through their private elevator, carrying nothing but her purse, her overnight bag, and the tiny life that would never know its father's voice. As the elevator descended through the building that had been her home for 3 years, she whispered a promise to the child growing inside her. "I'll love you enough for both of us, baby. I promise." What she didn't know was that Arsenio's business associate, David Kim, was already 3 blocks away, making a phone call that would change everything. The conversation he'd overheard from the terrace, Shirley's whispered words about the baby, hadn't been an accident. And the person on the other end of David's phone had been waiting 3 years for exactly this kind of information about the Barrett family's private life. By morning, Shirley's disappearance wouldn't be her own secret anymore. Chapter 3. The Discovery. Some victories taste like poison the moment you achieve them. Arsenio Barrett stood in the marble foyer of his penthouse at 6:47 a.m., still wearing his tuxedo from the night before, holding a crystal tumbler of whiskey that had become his breakfast of choice. The Shanghai deal was done, $500 million richer, 3 new luxury resorts secured, his empire expanded across 2 continents. He should have been celebrating. Instead, he felt empty. The penthouse stretched around him like a museum of his success. Italian marble floors that cost more than most people's houses. Original Picassos hanging on walls that had never heard genuine laughter, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that made him feel like a king ruling over an empty kingdom. Everything was perfect, pristine, and utterly lifeless. Just like his marriage. The thought sliced through his hangover like a blade. Where was Shirley? Usually she'd be in the kitchen by now, making his coffee the way he liked it, reading the financial papers so she could ask intelligent questions about his deals. Even when he barely acknowledged her efforts, she still tried to be part of his world. Shirley? His voice echoed through the empty space. No response, probably still sulking about last night. Women were so sensitive about everything. Couldn't take a joke, couldn't handle a little honest conversation between men. She'd get over it. She always did. That was the thing about Shirley. No matter how he treated her, she always forgave him, always came back with that hopeful smile that used to charm him and now just irritated him. Arsenio climbed the spiral staircase to their bedroom, loosening his bow tie and already planning his next conquest. The Tokyo deal was up for negotiation next week, and the Dubai project needed his attention. Success was a drug, and he was completely addicted to the high. He pushed open their bedroom door, expecting to find Shirley asleep, or maybe waiting up to apologize for embarrassing him at the party. What he found instead stopped his blood cold. The room was wrong, subtly, devastatingly wrong. Her perfume bottles were missing from the vanity. The romance novel she'd been reading was gone from her nightstand. Her jewelry box, the antique wooden one that had belonged to her grandmother, sat empty and open like a mouth screaming silently. But it was the object on their bed that made his legs give out. Another wooden box, smaller and infinitely more dangerous, sat in the exact center of their California King mattress like an executioner's block. What the hell? Arsenio's whiskey tumbler slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an echo of Shirley's champagne glass from the night before. The irony was lost on him as he stumbled toward the bed, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that felt suspiciously like panic. The wooden box was beautiful, carved mahogany with delicate roses etched into the lid. It was old, elegant, and utterly terrifying in its simplicity. His hand shook as he lifted the lid, revealing contents that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Her wedding rings lay on top, like discarded promises. The engagement ring he'd chosen himself, a flawless 5-carat emerald-cut diamond that had cost him 3 months' salary, back when 3 months' salary actually meant something. And beneath it, the simple gold band they'd exchanged during their vows, the one she'd never taken off, not even to shower, not even when her fingers swelled during their first year of marriage stress. Seeing them separated from her finger felt like seeing her naked corpse. Beneath the rings, a stack of letters bound with a silk ribbon. His name was written on each envelope in Shirley's elegant handwriting, some faded with age, others still fresh. How many letters had she written him? How long had she been pouring her heart onto paper while he ignored her living, breathing presence? With trembling fingers, he opened the first one. My darling husband, today marks our first wedding anniversary. I woke up this morning thinking about our vows, how you promised to cherish me in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse. I wanted to tell you that even on our worst days, loving you feels like the best decision I ever made. You've been working so hard lately, and I know the pressure is enormous. I just wanted you to know that your success doesn't define my love for you. You could lose everything tomorrow, and I'd still choose you. Always you. Forever you. Your devoted wife, Shirley. The letter was dated exactly 4 years ago. He'd been in Tokyo that week, closing his first international deal. He'd never known she'd written it. He'd never known she'd spent their first anniversary alone. His hands shook as he reached for the second letter. My dearest Arsenio, today you forgot my birthday. I know you didn't mean to. You've been so busy with the merger. But I spent the entire day hoping you'd remember, hoping you'd surprise me, hoping you'd come home with flowers and that sheepish grin you used to give me when you knew you'd messed up. Instead, you called at midnight to say you'd be in Chicago for another 3 days. I cried myself to sleep, holding the birthday gift you'll never know I bought for you, a vintage watch like the one your father wore. I wrapped it anyway. It's still in my closet, waiting for a celebration that will never come. I love you anyway. I always love you anyway. Shirley. Arsenio's chest felt like it was caving in. He remembered that Chicago trip. He'd closed the Peterson account and celebrated with champagne and caviar in his hotel suite. He'd never called home. He'd completely forgotten it was her birthday. How many birthdays had he missed? How many anniversaries had passed unnoticed while he chased deals and profit margins and the endless, insatiable hunger for more? Letter after letter revealed the woman he'd married and systematically destroyed. Each one was a window into a heart that had loved him completely, unconditionally, desperately, and each one was a knife in his chest as he realized what he'd thrown away. Today you came home and found me crying because my mother called to say Dad's cancer is getting worse. You asked if it was something important, and when I tried to explain, you said, "Can this wait? I have calls to make." I watched you walk away to your study, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt completely alone. Dad used to say that marriage meant never having to face anything by yourself. I think he was wrong. You missed my art show opening tonight. I know the London acquisition was important, but I'd been working on that exhibition for 8 months. It was my first show since we got married, and I wanted so badly for you to be proud of me. Instead, I stood there explaining to everyone why my husband couldn't be bothered to come. Mrs. Patterson asked if you even knew I was an artist. I realized I couldn't answer her because I'm not sure you remember who I was before I became your wife. Last night you made love to me, but you never looked at me, not once. Afterward, you rolled over and immediately started checking emails. I lay there wondering if I was just another business transaction to complete, another item to check off your daily list. This morning I found the lingerie I'd bought to surprise you still in its bag, tags on. You never noticed I was wearing it. I don't think you'd notice if I disappeared entirely. The final letter in the stack was different, shorter, simpler, and infinitely more devastating. My beloved Arsenio, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I can't watch you not love me anymore. I can't keep hoping you'll remember who we used to be. Most importantly, I can't raise our baby in a house where love is treated like a weakness and attention is rationed like a scarce commodity. Our baby Arsenio. I'm 12 weeks pregnant with your child, the family you said you couldn't imagine having with me. I was going to tell you at the party, but you made it clear how you feel about the thought of children with the woman you can't stand to be around. I'm not leaving to punish you. I'm leaving to protect myself and our child from a man who's forgotten how to love anything except his bank account. Maybe someday you'll remember who you used to be. When that day comes, if it comes, don't look for us. Some broken things can't be fixed, and I refuse to keep cutting myself on the pieces. I never stopped believing in us until the day you stopped believing in me. Goodbye, my love. Take care of yourself. Shirley. Arsenio read the letter 3 times before the words penetrated the wall of shock surrounding his brain. Pregnant. She was pregnant. Had been pregnant during the party when he'd said, "Oh God." The sound that came out of his throat was barely human. "Oh God, what have I done?" At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper like a sacred relic, lay a small framed photograph. Their wedding day. The moment right after their first kiss as husband and wife. In the picture, Arsenio was looking at Shirley like she was the sun, and she was gazing back at him like he'd hung the stars. They looked drunk on love, high on possibility, certain that nothing could ever touch the magic they'd found in each other. He turned the frame over with shaking hands and found her final message, written in the same elegant script that had filled every love letter. I never stopped believing in us until the day you stopped believing in me. Arsenio Barrett, master of the universe, builder of empires, conqueror of impossible deals, collapsed onto his marble floor and wept like a child. He cried for the woman who'd loved him when he had nothing to offer but dreams. He cried for the birthdays he'd missed, the art shows he'd ignored, the night she'd waited up while he chose business over her warm arms. He cried for his unborn child, who would grow up thinking Daddy didn't want them. Most of all, he cried because somewhere in his relentless pursuit of more, he'd lost track of everything that actually mattered. His phone rang. Probably another deal, another opportunity, another chance to build his fortune while his family crumbled around him. For the first time in 15 years, Arsenio Barrett let it ring. He had more important things to do. He had a wife to find, forgiveness to earn, and a child to meet. But as he reached for his phone to call every private investigator in New York, Arsenio didn't know that David Kim's mysterious phone call had already set wheels in motion. Someone had been waiting 3 years for Shirley to finally break, and they'd already moved to ensure that when Arsenio started looking for his wife, he'd find much more than he bargained for, because the Barrett family's private pain was about to become very public business. Chapter 4. The Empire Crumbles. When a man who has never begged for anything in his life finally falls to his knees, the whole world stops to watch him break. Arsenio Barrett stood in his corner office 70 floors above Manhattan, staring at 3 different private investigators who had just delivered the same impossible news. His wife had vanished without a trace. Not a single credit card transaction, not one security camera sighting, not even a whisper from the doormen who'd known her for 3 years. Shirley Harris Barrett had evaporated like smoke, taking his unborn child with her. "It's like she planned this for months," said Rebecca Torres, the most expensive private investigator in New York, her voice carrying a grudging respect. She closed her personal accounts gradually, used cash for everything, even avoided using her phone for the last 2 weeks before she disappeared. Whoever taught her to vanish knew exactly what they were doing. "Find her," Arsenio's voice came out raw, desperate. "Whatever it costs, find her. I don't care if you have to hire the FBI, the CIA, or God himself. Find my wife." The investigators exchanged glances. Rebecca leaned forward, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Barrett, when someone disappears this completely, it usually means they don't want to be found. Maybe you should consider, get out." The words came out quiet, deadly. "All of you, get out and don't come back without results." As the investigators filed out, Arsenio's assistant Jenny lingered in the doorway, her usually cheerful face drawn tight with something that looked suspiciously like disgust. She'd been with the company for 2 years, had watched him build his empire from the inside, and had always admired his ruthless efficiency. Now she looked at him like he was something she'd scrape off her shoe. "Is there something you'd like to say, Jenny?" Arsenio asked, his voice carrying the same ice that had closed 100 deals. "Mrs. Barrett used to bring coffee to everyone in the office," Jenny said quietly. "Not just the executives, everyone. The security guards, the cleaning staff, the interns. She remembered birthdays, asked about people's kids, sent flowers when someone was sick. She was the kindest person I've ever met." Arsenio's chest tightened. "Jenny, she came in here 3 weeks ago while you were in Shanghai," Jenny continued, her voice growing stronger. "She wanted to surprise you by redecorating your office with photos of your trips together. She spent hours hanging pictures, arranging them perfectly. You want to know what you said when you got back?" He didn't want to know. He desperately didn't want to know. You said the office looked cluttered and unprofessional. You told her to remove everything and never touch your workspace again. She took down every single photo without saying a word, but I saw her crying in the elevator. Jenny's eyes blazed with righteous fury. She was trying so hard to connect with you, and you treated her like she was some annoying intern. That's enough. No, it's not enough. Jenny slammed a folder onto his desk. You want to know why you can't find her? Because you spent 3 years teaching her that she was worthless. You want to know why she left? Because any woman with an ounce of self-respect would have left years ago. The folder hit his desk like a bomb. Inside were printed emails, phone records, meeting transcripts, all documenting his treatment of his wife over the past 2 years. Jenny had been keeping track, building a case file of his cruelty without him even knowing. I quit, Jenny said simply. I can't work for someone who throws away gold and calls it garbage. And Mr. Barrett? I hope she never comes back. She deserves so much better than you. The door slammed behind her, leaving Arsenio alone with the evidence of his own monstrosity. He flipped through the folder with growing horror. Email after email where he'd dismissed Shirley's attempts to communicate, phone logs showing weeks where he'd spoken to his lawyers more than his wife, meeting notes where he'd scheduled business dinners on their anniversary without even consulting her calendar. The worst was a transcript from a conference call 6 months ago where his business partner had asked if he wanted to include Shirley in the company Christmas party planning. Why would I include her? Arsenio had said. She doesn't know anything about business. Besides, she'll just get emotional about the decorations or some other meaningless detail. Keep her out of it. Reading his own words now felt like swallowing glass. His intercom buzzed. Mr. Barrett? His new temporary assistant's voice was carefully professional. Your mother is here. Should I send her in? Before Arsenio could respond, the door burst open and Olga Burns stormed in like an avenging angel in Chanel. His mother was a formidable woman, 70 years old, 5 feet tall, and capable of reducing grown men to tears with nothing but her disapproval. Today, her silver eyes blazed with a fury that made her look positively biblical. You stupid, arrogant, worthless fool. Her accent, usually carefully modulated after 40 years in America, came out thick with Russian rage. What have you done? Mother, if this is about Shirley, Olga's voice rose to a pitch that could shatter crystal. My daughter-in-law, the sweetest, most patient angel who ever lived, has vanished because my son turned into a monster. Do you know what she did for my birthday last month? Arsenio's face went blank. He'd forgotten his mother's birthday entirely. She flew to Paris, Olga continued, her voice dripping with disgust. She spent 3 days with me, brought me photos of you from your childhood, told me stories about how proud she was to be your wife. She organized a surprise party with all my friends, bought me a necklace that belonged to her own grandmother, a family heirloom, Arsenio, and gave it to me because she said I was the mother she'd always dreamed of having. Each word hit him like a physical blow. I didn't know. You didn't know because you don't pay attention to anything except your bank account. Olga picked up a crystal paperweight from his desk, and for a moment Arsenio thought she might actually throw it at him. That woman loved you like you were her religion, and you treated her like she was your servant. She left me, Arsenio said weakly, gesturing at the wooden box. She just left. She left because you killed her. Olga's voice broke on the words. Not with your hands, but with your indifference. Every day, a little more. You took the most loving woman I've ever met, and you murdered her spirit piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a ghost walking through your penthouse. Arsenio sank into his chair, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured balloon. I know. God help me, I know. I found her letters, Mother. Years of letters I never read, never received, never knew existed. She was trying to reach me, and I was too blind to see. Letters? Olga's fury faltered for a moment, replaced by something that might have been hope. What kind of letters? He handed her the stack, watching his mother's face crumble as she read. Tears, actual tears from a woman who'd survived Stalin's purges and emigrated to America with nothing but determination, streamed down her cheeks. "Oh, my sweet girl," Olga whispered. "My poor sweet girl, look what we did to her." "We?" Olga's eyes flashed. "You think this is all your fault? I was the one who told you emotion was weakness. I was the one who said successful men couldn't afford to be distracted by their wives' feelings. I taught you that love was a luxury you couldn't afford." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I killed my own daughter-in-law with my poison advice, and now she's gone." "I'll find her," Arsenio said, desperation making his voice crack. "I'll hire every investigator in the country. You'll what?" Olga laughed bitterly. "You'll drag her back to a life where she felt invisible. You'll force her to raise a child with a man who called her pathetic in public. Why would she want to be found by you?" The question hit him like a slap. Why would Shirley want him to find her? What could he possibly offer her now, except more of the same treatment that had driven her away in the first place? His phone rang. The Shanghai investors, probably wanting to celebrate their successful deal. For the first time in 15 years, Arsenio Barrett looked at a business call and felt nothing but revulsion. He let it ring. "I have to try," he said finally. "I have to find her and grovel, beg, whatever it takes. I have to tell her I'm sorry, that I know what I did, that I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to her." "And if she says no?" Olga asked quietly. "If she's found peace without you? If she's happier gone?" The question hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Arsenio stared out his office windows at the city spread below him, his kingdom, his empire, his monument to success that meant absolutely nothing without the woman who'd built it alongside him. "Then I'll have learned the most expensive lesson of my life," he said quietly, "that you can gain the whole world and lose everything that actually matters." His phone buzzed with a text message. For one wild, impossible moment, his heart leaped with the thought that it might be Shirley. Instead, it was from David Kim. "We need to talk. Now about your wife's disappearance. Come alone." Arsenio stared at the message, ice forming in his veins. David Kim was his business associate, not his friend. He was ambitious, calculating and utterly ruthless in pursuit of his own interests. He was also the one person who'd been close enough to overhear conversations from their terrace. What did David Kim know about Shirley's disappearance? And more importantly, what did he want in exchange for that information? Chapter 5. The Hidden Paradise. Sometimes the most beautiful prisons are the ones we build for ourselves, and sometimes the greatest freedom comes from having nothing left to lose. Shirley Wilson, she still wasn't used to hearing her grandmother's maiden name, stood behind the counter of Moonrise Books and Cafe, her 7 months pregnant belly making it impossible to hide her condition any longer. The tiny bookstore smelled like coffee, old paper, and the lavender candles Mrs. Delacroix burned every morning, scents that had become more comforting than any luxury she'd left behind in Manhattan. The morning rush had just ended, leaving behind the gentle quiet that made this place feel like sanctuary. Through the salt-stained windows, she could see the Pacific Ocean, stretching endlessly toward a horizon that promised infinite possibilities, so different from the steel and glass cage of her former penthouse, where the view had been nothing but other people's ambitions reaching toward an empty sky. "You're glowing today, dear," said Mrs. Delacroix, the 70-year-old owner who'd taken Shirley under her wing without asking questions about her past. "That baby is going to be absolutely beautiful." Shirley smiled, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly where tiny feet kicked against her ribs like a drummer keeping perfect time. "She's active today. I think she likes the Mozart we've been playing." "She?" Mrs. Delacroix's eyes sparkled with the kind of genuine interest that Shirley had forgotten existed. "You know it's a girl?" "Just a feeling," Shirley lied. She knew because Dr. Martinez at the local clinic had told her last week during her checkup. A healthy baby girl with strong lungs and her father's stubborn heartbeat. Shirley had cried in the parking lot afterward, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she was going to be someone's mother, someone's whole world, someone's safe harbor in the storm. Her daughter would never feel invisible. The truth was more complicated than a feeling. Late at night, when insomnia kept her walking the cottage floors, she would press both hands to her belly and whisper stories about the man her daughter would never know. "Your daddy has the most beautiful green eyes," she'd say to the darkness. "He used to write me poetry on hotel napkins when we were dating. He once drove 4 hours through a snowstorm just to bring me soup when I had the flu." These midnight confessions were her way of keeping Arsenio alive for their child, even as she tried to bury him in her own heart. The bell above the door chimed, and Tommy Rodriguez burst in like a small hurricane, his backpack trailing papers and his face bright with excitement. At 7 years old, Tommy was her favorite customer. A boy whose single mother worked 2 jobs and couldn't always afford new books. So Shirley had started the Reading Champion program, where kids could earn free books by helping around the store. "Miss Wilson! Miss Wilson!" Tommy bounced on his toes, practically vibrating with energy. "I finished the dragon book. Can I start the wizard one now? Please?" "Of course you can, champion." Shirley reached behind the counter for the book she'd already set aside for him. "But first, tell me what you learned about friendship from the dragon story." Tommy's face grew serious, the way children's faces do when they're sharing something important. The dragon wasn't really mean. He was just lonely and scared, so he acted mean to protect himself. But when the knight showed him kindness instead of fighting, the dragon remembered how to be good again. Shirley's throat tightened. From the mouth of babes came wisdom that cut straight to the bone. "That's very wise, Tommy." "Are you crying, Miss Wilson?" Tommy's small face scrunched with concern. "Did I say something wrong?" "No, sweetheart." She wiped her eyes, forcing a smile. "You said something very right. Sometimes grown-ups forget how to be kind, and it takes someone special to remind them." "Like how you remind everyone?" Tommy asked with the innocent honesty that only children possess. "Mama says you make everyone in town feel special. She says you're like sunshine in a person." Sunshine in a person. The phrase hit her like a revelation. If only Arsenio could see her through this child's eyes, not as pathetic furniture, but as someone who brought light to other people's lives. Here in Moonrise Bay, she'd discovered parts of herself that had been buried under years of trying to be the perfect billionaire's wife. She taught art classes at the community center on Thursday evenings, helped elderly Mrs. Patterson with her grocery shopping every Tuesday, and had become the unofficial keeper of everyone's secrets and sorrows. In Manhattan, she'd been Mrs. Arsenio Barrett, a title that came with expectations but no real identity. Here she was simply Shirley, and that was enough. More than enough. "Tommy, would you like to help me with story time today?" Shirley asked, needing to focus on something other than the past that still haunted her dreams. "We're reading about brave princesses who save themselves." "Girls can be brave?" Tommy's eyes went wide. "Like really brave? Like fighting dragons brave?" "Especially girls," Shirley said firmly. "Sometimes the bravest thing a princess can do is walk away from a tower that's not treating her like the treasure she is." The afternoon reading circle had grown since she'd started it 3 months ago. What began with just Tommy and 2 other children had expanded to include nearly a dozen kids whose parents drove from neighboring towns just so their children could experience Shirley's storytelling magic. She had a gift for making each child feel like the hero of their own adventure, for helping them see that strength came in many forms. As Tommy settled into the reading corner with the other children who'd gathered for afternoon story time, Shirley felt the familiar ache of wondering what her daughter's childhood would look like. Would she be brave like these storybook princesses? Would she believe in her own worth the way her mother was finally learning to? Would she grow up knowing she was wanted, cherished, celebrated for exactly who she was? Most importantly, would she ever wonder why her father never came looking for them? The thought still hurt, even after 7 months. Part of her, the foolish, romantic part that had fallen in love with a man who wrote her poetry and brought her wildflowers, still hoped that Arsenio would move heaven and earth to find them, that he'd realized what he'd lost and would come charging through that bookstore door like a knight in shining armor, ready to fight for their love. But the practical part of her, the part that had learned to read the weather in his moods and navigate the storms of his indifference, knew better. Arsenio Barrett didn't fight for anything that didn't have a clear return on investment, and she'd proven definitively that loving her was a losing proposition. During her darkest moments, usually around 3 a.m. when the baby's kicking kept her awake and the cottage felt too quiet, she would allow herself to imagine what it would be like if he walked through that door. Would he be angry, relieved? Would he even recognize the woman she'd become, this stronger version of herself who could change a flat tire and balance a budget and make children laugh until their bellies hurt? Sometimes she practiced the conversation in her mirror, trying on different versions of forgiveness and fury, testing how the words would taste in her mouth. But every imagined reunion ended the same way, with her realizing that the man she'd fallen in love with had never really existed, and the man who'd destroyed their marriage wasn't someone she wanted in her daughter's life. Miss Wilson, 8-year-old Lucy Martinez, tugged on her skirt, pulling her back to the present. The story says the princess waited for the prince to rescue her, but what if the prince never came? What if he forgot about her? Shirley knelt down carefully, meeting the little girl's serious brown eyes. Then the princess would have to rescue herself, wouldn't she? And you know what? She'd discover she was stronger than she ever imagined. But what about love? Lucy persisted with the relentless curiosity of childhood. Don't princesses need love? Love comes in many forms, sweetheart. Shirley glanced around the reading circle at the children who'd become her chosen family, at Mrs. Delacroix, who treated her like the daughter she'd never had, at the community that had embraced her without knowing her story. Sometimes, the love you need is already all around you, just waiting for you to be brave enough to accept it. As story time ended, and the children scattered like dandelion seeds into the late afternoon sunshine, each one hugging her goodbye and promising to be good for their parents, Shirley allowed herself to imagine her daughter growing up here, running on the beach with Tommy and Lucy, learning to read in this very corner, surrounded by people who would love her for exactly who she was, rather than who they wanted her to become. The vision was so vivid, it took her breath away. A little girl with Arsenio's green eyes and her own stubborn chin, building sandcastles and catching fireflies and never once doubting that she deserved to take up space in the world. It was a beautiful vision, so beautiful it almost made up for the fact that her daughter would grow up never knowing her father's voice. "Shirley, dear." Mrs. Delacroix appeared at her elbow, concern creasing her weathered features. "You've been crying again. The baby—" "The baby's fine," Shirley assured her quickly, "just thinking about the future." "And the father?" Mrs. Delacroix asked gently. She'd never pressed for details, but she wasn't blind to the pain that sometimes flickered across Shirley's face when she thought no one was looking. Shirley's hand moved to her belly, where tiny fists were practicing boxing against her ribs with increasing frequency. Her daughter was going to be a fighter. She could feel it in every determined kick, every restless movement. The father made his choice long before he knew about her. We're better off without him. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but it was easier than admitting the truth, that she still loved Arsenio Barrett with a love so deep it felt like drowning, that she dreamed about him every night and woke up reaching for empty air. That part of her would always be waiting for him to become the man she'd married instead of the stranger he'd transformed into. But even as she said the words, her treacherous heart whispered lies about second chances and redemption stories and love that could overcome any obstacle. She'd read too many fairy tales, believed in too many happy endings. Real life wasn't a storybook. Real life was a woman 7 months pregnant, working in a bookstore 3,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, trying to convince herself that love was enough when she had to provide it all by herself. The sunset through the bookstore windows painted everything gold and amber, the same colors that used to dance in Arsenio's eyes when he looked at her like she was his miracle. Shirley closed her eyes and let herself remember, just for a moment, what it felt like to be someone's whole world. Then she opened them, straightened her shoulders, and got back to the business of building a life worth living. Because her daughter deserved a mother who knew her own strength, not a woman who waited around for men who'd forgotten how to love. What Shirley didn't know was that at that exact moment, 3,000 miles away, Arsenio Barrett was sitting in a downtown Manhattan warehouse, staring across a metal table at David Kim and realizing that his wife's disappearance wasn't the random act of a broken woman, it was the carefully orchestrated opening move in a game he'd never seen coming. And David Kim was about to tell him exactly who'd been pulling the strings. Chapter 6. The Mother's Quest. The most dangerous person in any war is the one who has nothing left to lose except the people they love. Olga Burns sat in the back of a hired sedan, watching the Oregon coastline roll past her window like scenes from a dream she'd never dared to have. 70 years old, worth $50 million in her own right, and she was driving toward a confrontation that could either heal her family or destroy what little remained of it forever. The manila folder on her lap contained everything. Rosa Martinez, the retired FBI agent she'd hired, had worked miracles. Credit card receipts from a pharmacy in Moonrise Bay, a job application at a local bookstore under the name Wilson, even a rental agreement for a cottage by the sea. Her daughter-in-law hadn't just disappeared. She'd been reborn. "Turn here," Rosa said from the front seat, consulting her tablet. "The bookstore should be 3 blocks down on the right. Blue shutters, hand-painted sign. And Mrs. Burns, remember what we discussed. Don't approach her directly. Let me assess the situation first." Olga nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed to run into that bookstore and gather Shirley into her arms like the daughter she'd always secretly considered her to be. 9 months of searching, 9 months of watching her son destroy himself with guilt and grief, 9 months of wondering if she'd ever meet her grandchild. Today, she would finally know. The sedan pulled up across from Moonrise Books and Cafe, and Olga's heart nearly stopped. There, visible through the large front window, stood a woman with familiar grace and gentle movements, her pregnancy advanced and beautiful. Even from a distance, even with her hair longer and her clothes simpler, Olga would have recognized Shirley anywhere. "Is that her?" Rosa asked softly. "That's my daughter," Olga whispered, tears already blurring her vision. "My sweet, precious daughter." Through the window they watched Shirley moving between tables, serving coffee to customers with the same natural warmth she'd brought to Barrett family gatherings. She was laughing at something a customer said, her whole face lighting up in a way Olga hadn't seen in years. Even heavily pregnant, even living in exile from everything she'd known, Shirley radiated a peace that had been missing from her life as Mrs. Barrett. "She looks happy," Rosa observed carefully. "She looks free," Olga corrected, the words coming out like a confession. "For the first time since I've known her, she looks completely free." The observation cut deep. How had she helped create a prison so suffocating that escaping it required abandoning an entire identity? When had loving her son become synonymous with destroying the woman who made him whole? "There's something else," Rosa said, checking her notes. "I spoke to several people in town yesterday. They adore her, call her their sunshine girl. She teaches art classes to kids, volunteers at the senior center, has basically become the unofficial heart of this community. This isn't a woman hiding, Mrs. Burns. This is a woman who's found her home." The words should have brought Olga joy. Instead, they filled her with a grief so profound, it felt like drowning. Shirley hadn't just left New York, she'd flourished without them. What did that say about the life they'd offered her? What did it say about the family she'd married into? "I want to go in," Olga said suddenly. "Alone." "Mrs. Burns, we discussed this." "I don't want to watch my daughter from a distance like she's some kind of specimen," Olga interrupted, her Russian accent thickening with emotion. "I want to hold her. I want to apologize. I want to meet my grandchild. And if she runs, if seeing you traumatizes her?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Olga stared at Shirley through the window, 8 months pregnant, glowing with health and contentment, looking like a woman who'd finally learned to breathe freely. What right did she have to disrupt that peace? What right did any of them have to drag her back into the nightmare they'd helped create? But then Shirley moved, and Olga saw her profile clearly for the first time. Even in her happiness, even surrounded by people who clearly adored her, there was something in Shirley's expression, a shadow of longing, a flicker of sadness that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. She was thinking about them, about him. "She still loves him," Olga whispered, the realization hitting her like lightning. "After everything, she still loves my stupid, blind son." "How can you tell?" "Because I know that look." Olga's hand pressed against the cool window glass. "I wore it for 20 years after my husband died. It's the look of a woman whose heart is in 2 places at once, grateful for the peace she's found, but grieving for the love she had to leave behind." Rosa studied Shirley's face through her binoculars. "You might be right. She touches her belly when she looks out the window like she's talking to the baby about someone. About its father." Olga's voice was certain. "She's telling that baby about Arsenio. Even after he broke her heart, she's keeping his memory alive for their child." The observation shattered something in Olga's chest. Even in exile, even carrying his baby alone, Shirley was protecting Arsenio's place in their child's life. The generosity of spirit it required was staggering, and completely in character for the woman who'd spent 5 years loving a man who'd forgotten how to love her back. "I have to talk to her," Olga said, reaching for the door handle. "Today. Now. Mrs. Burns. Rosa." Olga's voice carried the authority of a woman who'd survived revolution, immigration, and 50 years of New York society politics. "I've spent 9 months wondering if my grandchild would ever know their grandmother's love. I've watched my son destroy himself with regret, while the woman who could heal him lives 3,000 miles away, alone and pregnant, and probably terrified about facing motherhood without support. I will not spend one more day being a coward." Before Rosa could stop her, Olga was out of the sedan and crossing the street with determination that would have made her ancestors proud. The bookstore's wind chimes sang in the ocean breeze like a welcoming song, and the hand-painted sign promised books, coffee, and stories worth telling. Through the window, she watched Shirley arrange a display of children's books about family, stories of grandparents and parents and babies who brought joy wherever they went. The irony was almost too painful to bear. Olga pushed open the door, setting off a cheerful bell that made Shirley look up from her work. For a moment, time stopped. Recognition flashed across Shirley's face like lightning, surprise, fear, joy, and terror all warring in her brown eyes. Her hands went instinctively to her belly, protecting her unborn daughter from whatever storm was about to break. "Hello, sweetheart," Olga said softly, her voice breaking on the endearment she'd never allowed herself to use when they were still family. "You look beautiful." Shirley's face went white as paper. "Olga, how did you... Why are you..." Her legs seemed to give out and she grabbed the counter for support. Oh God, is Arsenio here?" "No, darling, no, he doesn't know I found you." Olga moved slowly, carefully, like she was approaching a wounded animal. "But we need to talk. About the baby. About my son. About how we destroyed the best thing that ever happened to our family." "I can't," Shirley whispered, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "I can't go through this again. Please, Olga. Please don't make me go through this again." Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Delacroix appeared from the back office, her grandmother's instincts activated by the distress in Shirley's voice. "Is everything all right? Who is this woman?" Shirley looked between the two women, one who represented her painful past, one who'd become her chosen family. For a moment, Olga saw her calculating escape routes, preparing to run again, to vanish into another new identity rather than face the Barrett family legacy. "This is Arsenio's mother," Shirley said finally, her voice barely audible. My former mother-in-law." Mrs. Delacroix's eyes narrowed with protective fury. "The family that hurt you? The ones who made you cry yourself to sleep for months? You have some nerve showing up here, lady." "Yes," Olga said simply, meeting the older woman's glare without flinching. "I do. Because that's my grandchild she's carrying, and my son is dying without them both. And because I've spent 9 months realizing that the biggest mistake of my life was not protecting her from the monster I helped create." The admission hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Shirley's eyes went wide with shock. In 5 years of marriage, she'd never heard Olga Burns admit to being wrong about anything. "You came alone?" Shirley asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "I came to apologize," Olga said, her proud shoulders finally bowing under the weight of her guilt. "I came to beg forgiveness from the daughter I failed to protect. And I came to ask if there's any chance, any hope at all, that love might be stronger than the damage we've done." Outside the bookstore window, storm clouds gathered over Moonrise Bay like harbingers of the emotional tempest about to break. And 3,000 miles away, in a Manhattan warehouse, Arsenio Barrett was about to discover that David Kim's betrayal was just the beginning of a conspiracy that threatened to destroy not just his marriage, but everything he'd ever built. Because some secrets are worth killing for, and some people had been waiting years for the Barrett family to finally tear itself apart. Chapter 7. The Conspiracy Revealed. The worst betrayals come from the people who smile at your wedding and then spend years plotting your funeral. Arsenio Barrett sat across from David Kim in an abandoned warehouse in Queens, watching his supposed business partner light a cigarette with hands that shook slightly, the only sign that David understood exactly how dangerous this conversation was about to become. The warehouse smelled like rust, old concrete, and secrets that had been rotting in the dark for far too long. "Before I tell you what I know about your wife," David said, exhaling smoke like a dragon preparing to burn down everything Arsenio thought he understood about his life, "you need to understand something about the Shanghai deal you're so proud of. It was never about the hotels." "What are you talking about?" Arsenio's voice came out harder than steel, but inside, ice was forming in his veins. David's smile held no warmth, just the cold satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "The Shanghai deal was about positioning you for a hostile takeover," David continued, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "See, some very powerful people have been watching Barrett luxury resorts for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to move. But they needed you distracted, isolated, vulnerable. They needed your judgment compromised." You're insane. But even as Arsenio said it, pieces were clicking into place like bullets loading into a chamber. David's sudden appearance in his inner circle 3 years ago, his helpful suggestions about business strategy, his constant presence at family gatherings, always watching, always listening, always learning their weaknesses. Am I? David pulled out a tablet, swiping to a series of photographs that made Arsenio's blood freeze. Pictures of him and Shirley at private dinners taken with a telephoto lens, audio transcripts of arguments they'd had in their own home, financial records showing every penny Shirley had spent, every place she'd gone, every friend she'd confided in. "You've been watching us," Arsenio whispered, his voice hollow with horror. "For 3 years you've been watching my wife." "Studying her," David corrected, "learning her patterns, her habits, her breaking point. It was fascinating, really, watching you systematically destroy the strongest woman I've ever met. My employers were impressed by how efficiently you did their work for them." "Who?" The word came out like a gunshot. "Who hired you?" David's smile widened, showing teeth like a shark's. "Someone who remembers when Barrett Hotels were just a small family business. Someone who never forgot what your father took from them 40 years ago. Someone who's been planning this revenge since before you were born." The warehouse suddenly felt like a tomb. Arsenio's mind raced through decades of his father's business dealings, trying to identify enemies who might harbor grudges across generations. "My father's been dead for 15 years. But his sins live forever," David said softly. "Just like his empire. Did you know that in 1982 your father acquired the Celestial Hotel chain through what the owners called aggressive negotiation tactics? The family that built those hotels, 3 generations of work, lost everything in a single hostile takeover. The patriarch died of a heart attack 6 months later. His widow swore on his grave that someday the Barrett family would know what it felt like to lose everything they loved." "You're talking about ancient history." "I'm talking about Sophia Morrison Whitfield." David's voice carried the weight of destiny. "The woman who spent 40 years building her own empire, waiting for the perfect moment to take yours apart, piece by piece." The name hit Arsenio like a physical blow. Sophia Morrison Whitfield, the mysterious billionaire who owned the Morrison-Whitfield Consortium, the shadowy figure behind half the major hotel acquisitions in Asia. He'd been trying to identify his competition for years, never knowing that his enemy had been watching him through a microscope, learning his every weakness, planning his destruction with surgical precision. "She hired you to destroy my marriage," Arsenio said, the truth crystallizing like poison in his mind. "I was hired to accelerate your existing problems," David corrected, "to whisper in your ear about how clingy your wife was becoming, how much more successful you could be without emotional distractions. To schedule meetings during your anniversaries, to suggest business trips during important family moments, to slowly, carefully, systematically isolate you from the one person who could have saved you from becoming exactly the kind of man she could destroy." Arsenio's hands clenched into fists. "You poisoned my mind against Shirley." "I simply fed tendencies that were already there," David said with clinical detachment. "Your father's son, after all. Ambitious, ruthless, willing to sacrifice anything for success. I just helped you choose business over love often enough that love gave up trying." "Where is she?" Arsenio's voice came out raw, desperate. "Where is my wife?" "Safe," David said, and for the first time, something almost like regret flickered in his eyes. "For what it's worth, watching her break was harder than I expected. She's a good woman, Arsenio, better than you deserved. When I overheard her talking to her unborn child about how Daddy didn't want them, even I felt sick about what I'd helped accomplish. You son of a—" "But the job is done," David continued ruthlessly. Your wife is gone, your marriage is destroyed, your reputation is in ruins, and your business judgment is compromised by guilt and desperation. Tomorrow, Sophia Morrison Whitfield will make her move. Barrett Luxury Resorts will be offered a merger that you'll be in no position to refuse. And just like that, the empire your father stole will return to its rightful owners. I'll fight her, Arsenio snarled, rising from his chair like an avenging angel. I'll expose this whole conspiracy. You'll what? David's laughter was cold as winter. Sue me for having conversations with you? Prosecute Sophia for making business moves? Everything we did was legal, Arsenio. Immoral as hell, but perfectly legal. We never threatened your wife, never forced you to treat her badly, never made you choose business over love. We just encouraged your natural instincts. The truth of it hit harder than any physical blow. David was right. Everything that had destroyed his marriage had come from Arsenio's own choices, his own cruelty, his own blindness. The conspiracy had simply held up a mirror to the monster he'd already become. But I will tell you where she is, David said, stubbing out his cigarette like he was extinguishing Arsenio's last hope. On one condition. Name it. Walk away from Barrett Luxury Resorts. Tonight, sign over your shares to Sophia Morrison Whitfield without a fight, and I'll give you an address. Try to fight this, and your wife and child disappear forever. And trust me, Sophia's resources make yours look like pocket change. Arsenio stared at the man who'd spent 3 years orchestrating his downfall, feeling something shift inside his chest like tectonic plates moving. His father's empire versus his father's grandchild. The business he'd built his identity around versus the family he'd never learned to value. For the first time in his life, the choice was crystal clear. Deal, he said without hesitation. Give me the address. David's eyebrows rose in surprise. Just like that? You're walking away from $1 billion empire? I'm walking toward the only empire that actually matters, Arsenio said, holding out his hand. My family. Now give me my wife's location, or I'll tear this city apart until I find her myself. David smiled, genuine this time, almost admiring. Maybe there's hope for you after all. He slid a piece of paper across the table. Moonrise Bay, Oregon. But Arsenio? She's built a life there. A good life. She's 8 months pregnant and due any day. If you show up as the same man who drove her away, you'll lose her forever. Then I guess I better figure out how to become someone worthy of getting her back. As Arsenio walked out of the warehouse, the address burning in his pocket like a promise, he didn't know that 3,000 miles away, his mother was about to have the most important conversation of her life. And he had no idea that in exactly 12 hours, everything he thought he knew about love, forgiveness, and second chances was about to change forever. Chapter 8. The Grandmother's Reckoning. When two women who love the same man finally stop fighting each other and start fighting for him, miracles become possible. The silence in Moonrise Books and Cafe stretched like a tightrope between two hearts that had been shattered by the same man. Shirley gripped the counter so tightly her knuckles went white, her 8 months pregnant belly making her feel vulnerable and exposed under Olga's intense gaze. Mrs. Delacroix hovered nearby like a protective mother hen, ready to call the police if this stranger threatened her beloved surrogate daughter. Please, Shirley whispered, her voice breaking. Please don't tell him where I am. I can't survive losing him again. Olga's heart cracked open at the raw terror in Shirley's voice. This wasn't the confident museum curator who'd captured her son's heart, or even the elegant society wife who'd graced Barrett family gatherings with quiet dignity. This was a wounded woman who'd been hurt so deeply that the mere mention of the man she loved sent her into a panic. Sweetheart, Olga said softly, taking a careful step forward. I'm not here to drag you back to a life that hurt you. I'm here to tell you that the man who destroyed your marriage isn't my son anymore. Don't. Shirley's hand moved protectively to her belly, where tiny feet kicked against her ribs as if sensing their mother's distress. "Don't give me hope. I can't carry hope for both of us anymore. It's too heavy." The words hit Olga like physical blows. Hope had become a burden for this woman. That was what they'd done to her. They'd made love feel like a punishment, and hope feel like foolishness. "Mrs. Wilson," Mrs. Delacroix interrupted, her voice sharp with protective fury. "You don't have to talk to this woman. I can call Sheriff Rodriguez." "It's okay, Mrs. D," Shirley said quietly, though tears were streaming down her cheeks. She was family once, before everything fell apart." "Family doesn't abandon family," Mrs. Delacroix said pointedly, glaring at Olga. "Family doesn't let their children destroy the people they're supposed to love." "You're absolutely right," Olga said, her voice thick with shame. "I failed her. I failed them both. I let my son become a monster, and I did nothing to protect the woman who loved him more than life itself." The admission hung in the air like a prayer for forgiveness. Shirley's eyes went wide. In 5 years, she'd never heard Olga Burns take responsibility for anything, let alone admit to being wrong about something so fundamental. "You hated me," Shirley said, her voice barely a whisper. "From the moment Arsenio brought me home, you thought I wasn't good enough for your family." "I was terrified of you," Olga confessed, sinking into one of the cafe chairs like an old woman suddenly aware of her age. "You made my son soft, gentle, human. You made him laugh at terrible movies and dance in the kitchen and talk about dreams instead of just profit margins. I thought emotion was weakness, so I poisoned his mind against the best thing that ever happened to him. You told him I was holding him back. I told him love was a luxury he couldn't afford." Olga's voice broke on the words. "I told him that successful men didn't let their wives distract them from building empires. I taught him to see your love as nagging, your needs as inconvenience, your very presence as an obstacle to overcome." Shirley pressed both hands to her mouth, stifling a sob that came from someplace so deep it felt like it was tearing her soul in half. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've spent 9 months watching my son destroy himself with guilt," Olga said, rising from her chair and moving closer to Shirley with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "Because I've seen him lose 40 pounds, stop sleeping, turn his back on every business deal that used to define his existence. Because the man who used to care about nothing except money now spends his days reading the love letters you left him and crying like his heart has been ripped out." "Stop," Shirley whispered. "Please, stop." "He sleeps in your closet," Olga continued relentlessly. "Every night, surrounded by your clothes because it's the only place he can still smell your perfume. He carries your pregnancy test in his wallet, the one you left in that wooden box. He's shown it to me a dozen times, asking what he could have done differently, how he could have been so blind to something so precious." "He said he couldn't stand me," Shirley said, her voice rising with years of suppressed pain. "He said I was pathetic, clingy furniture that rearranged itself hoping to be noticed. He said he couldn't imagine having children with someone like me." "He said those things because I taught him to say them," Olga said, her own voice breaking with shame. "For 3 years, I whispered poison in his ear about how wives should know their place, how emotion was weakness, how successful men couldn't afford to be distracted by love. I turned my son into my late husband's ghost, cold, calculating, incapable of seeing past his own ambition." Mrs. Delacroix stepped forward, her protective instincts warring with her grandmother's heart as she saw Olga's genuine anguish. "The baby is due any day now," she said quietly. "Shirley's been having contractions all week. If you're here to upset her—" "I'm here to help deliver my grandchild if necessary," Olga said fiercely. "I'm here to protect them both from any more damage my family has caused, and I'm here to tell Shirley something that might change everything." "What?" Shirley asked, though she looked terrified to hear the answer. 3 days ago, Arsenio discovered that your disappearance was orchestrated by his business partners as part of a conspiracy to destroy his company, Olga said, watching Shirley's face carefully. Someone spent 3 years manipulating him into treating you badly, knowing that losing you would break him completely. And when he found out, when he learned that people had been using his love for you as a weapon against him, do you know what he did? Shirley shook her head, unable to speak. He walked away from Barrett Luxury Resorts, a billion-dollar empire that 3 generations of his family built. He signed it over to his enemies without a fight, because getting back to you mattered more than keeping everything else. The silence that followed was deafening. Shirley stared at Olga like she'd just spoken in a foreign language, her brain struggling to process information that contradicted everything she believed about her husband's priorities. "He gave up his company," she whispered finally. "For me? For you and the baby he didn't even know existed until he read your letters," Olga confirmed. "Shirley, my son is on his way here right now. He should arrive tomorrow morning, and I need to know, is there any chance, any hope at all, that you might be willing to let him try to earn your forgiveness?" Before Shirley could answer, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, so intense it doubled her over. Her water broke in a rush of fluid that splashed onto the hardwood floor, like her body had been waiting for this exact moment of emotional overload to bring her daughter into the world. "Oh!" she gasped, one hand clutching her belly, the other reaching blindly for support. "Oh no, not now! She's not due for 2 weeks!" Mrs. D double exclamation mark Shirley called out, panic creeping into her voice. I think the baby's coming." Mrs. Delacroix sprang into action with the efficiency of a woman who'd raised 6 children of her own. "Call Dr. Martinez and get the car. The roads to the hospital are still washed out from yesterday's storm." "Wait," Olga said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "I delivered 4 babies in Russia during the war. If we can't get to a hospital, I can help here." "You?" Shirley looked at her former mother-in-law with wild eyes. "You want to deliver your grandchild?" "I want to be here for you," Olga said simply. "The way I should have been for the last 3 years. The way a mother protects her daughter no matter what." Another contraction hit, and Shirley cried out, her legs giving way completely. Mrs. Delacroix caught her on one side, while Olga, despite being 70 years old, supported her on the other. "The apartment upstairs," Mrs. Delacroix said. "It's closer than trying to make it to town in this weather." As they helped Shirley toward the narrow staircase, another massive contraction seized her, and she screamed, not just from physical pain, but from the emotional overwhelm of having Arsenio's mother beside her during the most vulnerable moment of her life. "Breathe, sweetheart," Olga whispered, her voice gentle in a way Shirley had never heard before. "Your daughter is ready to meet the world, and I promise you, whether her father deserves it or not, this baby is going to be surrounded by love." Outside, thunder rolled across Moonrise Bay like the sound of destiny approaching. And 3,000 miles away, Arsenio Barrett was boarding a private jet, racing toward the most important reunion of his life, completely unaware that he was about to become a father in the middle of the storm. Chapter 9. The Father's Awakening. Some journeys begin with a single step, but the most important ones begin with falling to your knees and learning how to crawl toward redemption. Arsenio Barrett stood in the rain outside a cottage that looked like something from a fairy tale. White clapboard siding weathered by salt air, window boxes overflowing with wildflowers, and a front porch where wind chimes sang soft lullabies to the storm. After 18 hours of flying through hell to get here, after a white-knuckle drive through flooded coastal roads in a rental car that barely survived the journey, he'd finally found the place where his wife had chosen to rebuild her life without him. And he was terrified to knock on the door. The address David Kim had given him was burned into his memory like a brand. 47 Seashell Lane, Moonrise Bay, Oregon. Such a simple combination of numbers and words that represented everything he'd thrown away. Through the golden-lit windows, he could see movement, shadows dancing on walls that had probably never witnessed the cold efficiency of business calls or the hollow echo of emotional emptiness. This was a home where people actually lived, actually loved, actually talked to each other about things that mattered. Everything his penthouse had never been. Thunder rolled overhead like God laughing at the cosmic joke of Arsenio Barrett. Master of the universe, builder of empires, conqueror of impossible deals, standing in the rain like a beggar hoping for scraps of forgiveness from the woman whose heart he'd shattered. His Italian leather shoes, which had walked across marble floors of corporate boardrooms where million-dollar decisions were made with casual indifference, were now soaked through and caked with Oregon mud. He raised his fist to knock, then let it fall. What could he possibly say? What words could even begin to bridge the canyon of pain he'd carved between them? Sorry seemed pathetically inadequate for the magnitude of his failures. In his jacket pocket, he still carried her pregnancy test, the one she'd left in that wooden box, as if it were a sacred relic. He'd shown it to his reflection in bathroom mirrors across 3 states, asking the hollow-eyed stranger staring back at him how he could have been so blind. The man in those mirrors never had an answer, but then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. His baby, his child, the miracle Shirley had been trying to share with him on the night he'd called her pathetic in front of 50 people. "Oh, God," he whispered, his legs giving out completely. He sank to his knees on the cottage's front porch, rain soaking through his expensive suit, his whole body shaking with the realization that he was a father. Somewhere behind that door, his child, his son or daughter, was alive and breathing and crying and perfect, and he'd missed it all. He'd missed the first kick, the first ultrasound appointment where they could have learned the gender together, the moment when Shirley's body had started changing to accommodate their growing miracle. He'd missed her midnight cravings, her morning sickness, her wonder at feeling their baby move for the first time. He'd missed everything that mattered while chasing everything that didn't. The door opened before he could knock, and suddenly Shirley was standing there like an apparition from his most desperate dreams. She wore a simple white nightgown that made her look like an angel, her hair loose around her shoulders in waves that caught the lamplight behind her, her face glowing with the ethereal beauty of new motherhood. In her arms, she held a tiny bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket. Their baby, their miracle, their second chance made flesh. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. Those warm brown eyes that had once looked at him like he hung the moon now held a mixture of shock, fear, and something that might have been hope. She looked stronger than he remembered, more self-possessed, like she'd discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Arsenio?" Her voice was barely a whisper, like she couldn't quite believe he was real. He looked up at her from his knees, rain and tears making it impossible to see clearly, and tried to find words that could encompass the enormity of what he felt: love, regret, wonder, terror, hope. Emotions crashed through him like tsunamis, each one powerful enough to drown him completely. The sophisticated vocabulary that had closed billion-dollar deals and convinced investors to part with their money completely deserted him. "I'm so sorry," he managed, his voice breaking on every syllable. "Shirley, I'm so sorry for everything. For not seeing you, for not loving you the way you deserved, for saying those terrible things, for missing this moment, for—" "Stop," she said softly, and his heart nearly stopped beating. Was she going to send him away? Was he too late? Had he destroyed everything so completely that not even the birth of their child could bridge the gap between them? But then she did something that changed everything. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. "You're soaking wet," she said quietly, her voice carrying a gentleness he didn't deserve. "Come inside and meet your daughter." Daughter. The word hit him like lightning, illuminating his entire world in a single brilliant flash. He had a daughter, a little girl, who would probably have his eyes and her mother's heart, who would need him to be better than he'd ever been before, who would judge him not by his bank account, but by his presence at her bedside when she had nightmares. Arsenio rose on shaking legs and followed Shirley into the cottage that felt more like home in 30 seconds than his penthouse had in 3 years. The space was small, cozy, filled with books and soft lamplight, and the kind of warmth that comes from people who actually enjoy being in the same room together. There were fresh flowers on the kitchen table, children's drawings stuck to the refrigerator with colorful magnets, and the lingering scent of something that might have been homemade bread. It was everything he'd never known he wanted. "Her name is Isabella Rose," Shirley said, settling into a rocking chair near the fireplace with the practiced ease of someone who'd already mastered the art of moving with a newborn. "She was born 3 hours ago during the storm. Your mother helped deliver her." "My mother!" Arsenio's head spun with the implications. "Olga is here? She found me 2 days ago." Shirley's voice was carefully neutral, but he could hear layers of emotion beneath the surface, forgiveness, exhaustion, and something that sounded almost like gratitude. "We had a conversation about a lot of things, about you, about us, about the mistakes that brought us all to this moment." From the kitchen doorway, Olga appeared like a guardian angel in rumpled designer clothes. Her usually perfect appearance was completely destroyed. Hair wild from the storm, makeup smeared with tears of joy, clothes stained with evidence of the miracle she'd just helped facilitate. He'd never seen his mother look more beautiful. "You came," she said simply, her eyes bright with tears that she made no effort to hide. "You called," he replied, understanding passing between mother and son like electricity. "You said I had a daughter." "You do." Olga's voice carried wonder, pride, and a love so fierce it took his breath away. "Arsenio, she's perfect. She has your eyes and Shirley's gentle spirit and the strongest lungs I've ever heard on a newborn. She's going to be magnificent. She's going to change the world just by existing in it." Arsenio turned back to Shirley, hardly daring to breathe. The moment stretched between them like a tightrope over an abyss. Everything he'd ever wanted was right there, just a few feet away, wrapped in a yellow blanket, and completely dependent on the grace of the woman he'd failed so completely. May I hold her?" For a long moment, Shirley studied his face, really looked at him for the first time in years. She saw the weight he'd lost during his weeks of searching, the hollow desperation in his eyes, the way his hands trembled with longing and terror and hope. This wasn't the cold, dismissive man who'd called her pathetic in front of Manhattan's elite. This was someone who'd been broken down to his foundation and was begging for the chance to rebuild himself into something worthy of their love. "Sit down," she said finally, indicating the chair beside her with a gesture that felt like absolution. "Support her head like this. She's stronger than she looks, but she's still so new to this world." With infinite care, Shirley transferred their daughter into Arsenio's arms for the first time. The baby felt impossibly light and impossibly precious, like holding distilled starlight or crystallized hope. Isabella Rose opened her eyes, those unmistakable green eyes that were a perfect mirror of his own, and stared up at her father with the serious concentration of someone deciding whether this strange new person was worth trusting. Time stopped. The storm outside, the complicated history between him and Shirley, the corporate conspiracy that had driven them apart. None of it mattered in the face of this tiny person who was 50% him and 50% the woman he'd never stopped loving, even when he'd forgotten how to show it. "Hi, sweetheart," Arsenio whispered, his voice rough with tears he didn't try to hide. "I'm your daddy. I know I missed your birth, and I'm sorry. I've missed so much already, but I'm here now. If you'll let me, if your mama will let me, I want to spend the rest of my life making up for lost time. I want to be the father you deserve, the man your mother fell in love with." Isabella Rose made a small sound, not quite a cry, not quite a coo, and her tiny fist wrapped around Arsenio's finger with surprising strength. The simple gesture hit him like a meteorite, reducing him to tears that came from a place deeper than regret, deeper than guilt. Pure, overwhelming, life-changing love. It was the kind of love that rewrote everything, that made him understand why people talked about their children as if they'd invented the very concept of devotion. This was what he'd been missing while chasing deals and profit margins. This was what mattered. "She's beautiful," he sobbed, unable to look away from his daughter's perfect face. "God, Shirley, she's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Look at her fingers. They're so tiny, so perfect. And her hair, it's like silk." "She is," Shirley agreed softly, watching father and daughter meet for the first time with an expression that was part wonder, part heartbreak. "She's been waiting to meet you. I've been telling her stories about her daddy, about the man you used to be." "How can you say that?" Arsenio looked up at her, his green eyes, the same ones their daughter had inherited, blazing with self-recrimination. "How can you be so kind to me after what I did to you? After I drove you away while you were carrying my child? After I chose everything else over the two most important people in my life?" Shirley was quiet for a long moment, studying the man who'd broken her heart and the baby who'd healed it, seeing how perfectly Isabella fit in her father's arms, despite never having been there before. There was something magical about watching them together, something that felt like witnessing destiny. "Because," she said finally, "someone very wise once told me that the bravest thing a princess can do is forgive the dragon who forgot how to love. Not for the dragon's sake, but for her own. And because holding on to anger is like holding on to poison, it only hurts the person carrying it. I don't deserve forgiveness." "No," Shirley agreed, her honesty cutting deep but somehow gentle at the same time. "You don't. But Isabella deserves a father who's learned from his mistakes, and I deserve a partner who chooses love over everything else, every single day for the rest of our lives. The question is, are you capable of being that man?" The words hung between them like a bridge over an impossible chasm. Arsenio stared at his wife, his brave, magnificent wife who'd had the strength to leave him and the grace to let him back into her life, and felt something shift in his chest like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "I walked away from Barrett Luxury Resorts," he said quietly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "For 15 years, that company had been his identity, his worth, his everything. Signed over everything to the people who orchestrated this whole nightmare, the hotels, the money, the empire. I gave it all up to find you." Shirley's eyes went wide with shock. "You gave up your company, your father's legacy, for us? I gave up everything that didn't matter to get back the only things that do." He looked down at Isabella, who was falling asleep in his arms with the trust that only babies possess, her tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. "You and this perfect little girl are my real empire. Everything else was just noise, expensive, soul-crushing noise that kept me from hearing what actually mattered." "Arsenio, I know I have to earn you back," he continued, his voice gaining strength from holding his daughter, from feeling her weight against his chest like an anchor to everything good in the world. "I know saying sorry isn't enough, that I have to prove I've changed, that I have to spend every day for the rest of my life showing you that you and Isabella are my first priority, my only priority. I'm not asking you to trust me, I'm asking you to let me prove that I'm worthy of your trust." "And if I said it was too late?" Shirley asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the rain against the windows. "If I said I've learned to live without you, that Isabella and I have built a good life here, that we don't need you anymore?" The question hung in the air like a sword over his head. Arsenio looked around the cottage that felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever lived, at the woman who'd found the strength to rebuild herself from scratch, at the baby who'd been loved from the moment she was conceived, even though her father had been too blind to participate. "Then I'd ask if you'd let me stay anyway," he said finally. "Not as your husband. I know I have to earn that title back. But as Isabella's father, as someone who wants to learn how to love the way you love, unconditionally and completely. I'd ask for the chance to become the man you fell in love with 5 years ago, the man who wrote you poetry on hotel napkins and drove through snowstorms just to bring you soup. And if I said no? Then I'd respect your decision," he said, though the words came out like pieces of his soul being torn away. "But I'd never stop trying to prove I was worthy of a second chance. I'd buy the house next door and spend every day showing you that I've changed, that I've learned, that losing you was the lesson that finally taught me what actually matters in this life." Isabella stirred in his arms, opening her perfect green eyes to study his face with the serious concentration of someone making a very important decision. She looked from him to her mother and back again, as if she could sense the weight of the moment, the fragile hope hanging in the air between her parents. Then, as if she'd reached some internal conclusion, she made a soft, cooing sound and settled deeper into his embrace. "She likes you," Shirley observed, wonder creeping into her voice. "She's not usually this calm with strangers." "She's giving me a chance," Arsenio corrected, his voice thick with emotion. "She's braver than her old man. The question is, will you—" Before Shirley could answer, headlights cut through the storm outside, and the sound of car doors slamming reached them through the rain. Voices called out, men's voices, unfamiliar and urgent. Olga moved to the window, her face going pale as she peered through the curtains. "Shirley," she said, her voice tight with fear, "we need to go. Now." "What? Who is that?" "Sophia Morrison Whitfield's people," Olga said grimly, using the correct name of their enemy. "They followed me here. The conspiracy isn't over. It's just beginning." And as armed figures approached the cottage through the storm, Arsenio realized that protecting his family was about to require more than just emotional growth. It was about to require everything he had. Chapter 10. The Miracle of Love. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not by fighting your enemies, but by choosing to protect the love that makes fighting worthwhile. The armed men surrounding the cottage weren't there to hurt them. They were there to witness the end of a 40-year revenge plot that had finally consumed itself. Sophia Morrison Whitfield stepped through the storm like an aging empress, surveying her conquered kingdom, her silver hair perfect despite the rain, her eyes carrying the cold satisfaction of someone who'd spent decades planning this exact moment. "Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice cultured and deadly calm, "how fitting that you're here for the finale." Arsenio rose slowly from the chair where he'd been holding his daughter, every instinct screaming at him to shield his family from this woman who'd orchestrated their destruction. But Isabella Rose was sleeping peacefully in his arms, completely unaware that her first day of life was unfolding in the middle of a war that had begun before she was conceived. "You got what you wanted," Arsenio said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You destroyed my marriage, took my company, reduced me to nothing. What more could you possibly want?" Isabella's laugh was like broken crystal. "I wanted you to feel what my family felt when your father destroyed us. Helpless, betrayed, watching everything you loved disappear piece by piece." Her eyes moved to Shirley, who was pale but defiant as she stood beside Olga. "But I underestimated something important." "What's that?" "Love's capacity to heal what revenge tries to break." Victoria stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the baby in Arsenio's arms. "Your wife didn't just survive losing you, she flourished. She found strength I didn't know existed. And now, Her voice faltered for the first time. Now she's created exactly what my family lost. A perfect, innocent, new beginning. Sophia, came a voice from behind her. David Kim stepped into the cottage, but his expression wasn't triumphant. It was stricken with guilt. This has gone far enough. The baby changes everything. Does it? Sophia's voice was ice, but Arsenio could see something cracking in her composure. Why should Barrett family happiness matter more than mine did? Because revenge doesn't bring back the dead, Olga said firmly, moving to stand between Sophia and her family. It just creates more graves. I know. I spent 30 years poisoning my son's heart with bitterness about his father's enemies. Look what that wisdom accomplished. Sophia stared at the 4 generations in front of her, Olga protecting her daughter-in-law, Shirley radiating quiet strength despite everything she'd endured, Arsenio holding their newborn daughter like she was made of spun glass and starlight. For 40 years, she'd imagined the Barrett family as cold, calculating destroyers who felt nothing for anyone. Instead, she was witnessing a love story. Your father took everything from us, Isabella said to Arsenio, but her voice had lost its edge. Our hotels, our legacy, our future. My husband died believing he'd failed our children. And I'm sorry, Arsenio said simply. I'm sorry for his sins and my own, but destroying my family won't bring yours back. It will just mean more children grow up without fathers, more women raise babies alone, more love gets sacrificed to old hatred. Isabella Rose stirred in his arms, making soft baby sounds that seemed to fill the cottage with magic. Her tiny fist escaped the blanket, waving in the air like she was conducting a symphony of hope. She's beautiful, Isabella Morrison Blackwell whispered, and suddenly she didn't look like a vengeful empress anymore. She looked like what she really was, an elderly woman who'd spent 40 years nurturing hatred instead of healing, and was finally seeing what that choice had cost her. Would you like to hold her? Shirley asked suddenly, her voice gentle despite everything this woman had put them through. I dot. Isabella's composure cracked completely. I don't deserve to touch something so pure. None of us deserve love, Shirley said quietly. But we receive it anyway. That's what makes it a miracle. With trembling hands, Sophia took baby Isabella Rose into her arms. The moment their eyes met, ancient green meeting brand new green, something fundamental shifted in the cottage. 40 years of carefully constructed hatred crumbled like sandcastles before the tide. She has his eyes, Sophia whispered, looking between the baby and Arsenio. But her soul is pure light. Love does that, Olga observed. It creates light in the darkest places. I wanted to destroy your family the way mine was destroyed, Sophia confessed, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held the sleeping baby. But watching this little angel, knowing that my revenge brought her into existence, I can't. I won't. She handed Isabella Rose back to Shirley with reverent care. The company is yours again, Mr. Barrett, all of it. Consider it a baby gift from someone who remembers what it's like to love a child more than pride. Keep it, Arsenio said without hesitation. Build something beautiful with it. Build hotels that bring families together instead of tearing them apart. Make it a legacy of healing instead of revenge. Sophia stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. You're giving me $1 billion empire? I'm choosing my real empire, Arsenio corrected, moving to sit beside Shirley and their daughter. This, right here, the 3 of us together. Everything else is just money. Outside, the storm was finally passing, leaving behind the clean scent of rain-washed earth and new beginnings. Sophia Morrison Whitfield gathered her people and left as quietly as she'd arrived, carrying with her the realization that some victories taste too much like ashes to be worth winning. David Kim lingered in the doorway, his face heavy with shame. "For what it's worth," he said to Shirley, "watching him learn to love you again has been the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Some revenge plots end with destruction. This one ended with redemption." As the cottage fell quiet, 3 generations of the Barrett family sat together in the warm lamplight, watching Isabella Rose sleep with the perfect peace that only babies possess. Outside, Moonrise Bay settled into calm after the storm, and somewhere in the distance, the ocean sang lullabies to the stars. "So what happens now?" Shirley asked quietly, her head resting against Arsenio's shoulder as he held their daughter. "Now we begin again," Arsenio said, pressing a kiss to her hair that felt like a sacred vow. "We raise our daughter in a house where love comes first. We build a life where family matters more than profit margins. We prove that happy endings are possible, even for people who've made terrible mistakes." "And us," she whispered. "What about us?" Arsenio looked down at the woman who'd loved him at his worst and was giving him the chance to love her at his best. "We write a new story, one where the prince learns to be worthy of the princess, where love wins over pride, and where every day ends with 'I love you' instead of 'don't wait up.'" Isabella Rose opened her eyes one more time, looked up at her parents with ancient wisdom, and smiled. The first smile of her life, given to the moment when her family finally became whole.